So thank y'all for coming. This is going to be a really fun political financial education workshop. So I'm here, my name is Sierra Peters. I'm here with Giovanna Jones and Ariel Gray. Giovanna and Ari, do you all want to introduce yourselves quickly?
Yeah, I am Ariel. I work with Sierra at Print Ain't Dead,
Yeah.
which I'm sure she's probably told you guys about before. Apart from that, I'm an artist and writer, and I'm currently a producer at WBUR, our local NPR station. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I'm Giovanna, and I mentioned I lived in Somerville, but I'm from Randolph, Mass, and I am a PhD candidate at Harvard in African American Studies, with my affiliation in studies of women, gender, sexuality, and I work on things pertaining to Black women in space and spatial imagination, aesthetics, things like that. And basically, that's all I'm doing right now. I'm like, let me get this funding so I can keep writing and reading and just digging up some archives. So that's pretty much what I do. And then I joined with Ariel and Sierra. We just really connected on doing kind of these study sessions and just staying in community with one another and just supporting. So I feel like I'm just still involved in various sorts of things because Ariel and Sierra probably connected me to it. So I'm, besides doing my graduate work, I'm just here to pick up when Ariel and Sierra call.
Oh my God, you're giving us way too much credit. So I'm gonna share screen really quickly. Can you all see my screen? Okay. So as we stated before, my name is Sierra Peters. I'm here with Ari and Giovanna. And we're here to talk about study groups and the history of study groups a little bit. So I'll just get started in 1 second. So I wanted to share with you all actually just one thing. Let me pause the share that I thought was really interesting. And that was here. And so this is Tupac Shakur at the Marcus Garvey Freedom School, or I'm sorry, the Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles. There's no sound? Okay, just give me 1 second.
That's why your eyes never let up. Forgive, but don't forget, girl. Keep your head up. And when he tells you you ain't nothing, don't believe him. And if you can't learn to love you, you should leave him. Cause sister, you don't need him. And I ain't trying to catch up. I just call it how I see it. You know what makes me unhappy? When brothers make babies and leave the young mother to be a pet. Now, since we all came from a woman, got our name from a woman, and I came from a...
It's frozen now? Okay, you know what, it's fine. I wanted to share that because, you know, it's really interesting and important. The visual is frozen. Okay, sorry about that, y'all. Let me just stop the share. But I want to share that piece because it's at a school that was actually founded by a Black person. So it's founded by Dr. Anniam Palmer, who started it while he was a tenured professor at CSU in Los Angeles, which is the California State University. And he founded the Marcus Garvey School with his life savings. And, you know, he's founded it in 1975. And so I just thought that it was like really interesting and important grounding for the conversation that we're about to have today. And so I'll share my screen once more. And so when we think about like why it's important, like why study groups are important, why Black study is important, we need to kind of start with like the founding of this country, because unfortunately the United States is the only country to have on record legally that Black people cannot read. Like when we think about that, it's just like mind blowing, like why is that? And another, so like Ari said before, we founded Print Ain't Dead. And so, you know, again, we see through this FBI memo that, you know, the United States is tracking Black bookstores. And it's like, why would they have any reason to do that if they didn't know the power in study and the power of reading? And so just to read this a little bit, it says, and this is from 1968, it says, the Bureau has noted an increase in the establishment of Black extremist bookstores, which represent propaganda outlets for revolutionary and hate publication in cultural centers for extremism. Each office should locate and identify Black extremist and or African type bookstores in its territory and open separate discrete investigations on each to determine if it is extremist in nature. And it's just, it's just kind of funny, but it's also like when you see that the United States government is actively surveilling Black bookstores, like you see that it's so important. Like it's a very like interesting grounding into like why this work is so important. And so I guess I like to think about, this work in like a ton of different ways, but one thing that I definitely want to point out, and I'll try to be quick about it, Alila Walker, who was the child of Madam C.J. Walker, the hair care pioneer. So she was her only daughter, and she was hosting salons in her house in Harlem called the Dark Tower, and that is, only one of the few spaces that they had to start the Harlem Renaissance, and to, one of the few salon spaces that they had to like talk about the things that they needed to. So there was like W.B. Du Bois, a ton of like really important Black figures, and intellectuals. And so she organized celebrations, in the aftermath of like African-American troops returning from World War I. And she's just like, doing a lot of amazing, interesting work at her house on West 136th Street. And so I just thought that was also like very interesting grounding, for this conversation. And a lot of people thought of her, as like, even, in the film that they produced for Netflix, a lot of people thought of her as like a party girl, but she was actually, a foundation for, a foundation for artists. Langston Hughes said she had an apartment that held perhaps 100 people, and she would usually issue several hundred invitations to each party. And unless you went there early, there was no possibility of getting in. So these were like really important spaces to have conversations about the arts and, intellectual matters that people didn't have at that time. The second person that I just wanted to talk about was Septima Clark. And Septima Clark was an educator based in the South, and she taught a ton of students in South Carolina. And so she taught not only young students, but also she held informal literacy classes for adults. And she pushed education and equal rights in numerous organizations, such as the YWCA, the Foundation of the Federation of Women's Clubs, the Council of Negro Women. And she was actually, so in 1956, South Carolina banned membership in the NAACP, and she lost her teaching job and her pension when she refused to comply. So she refused to give up her membership, and she still kept teaching. I just thought that was like really important and interesting grounding when we think about, teaching in segregated schools at that time, like what people were actually willing to give up in order to continue this work of teaching. We also, want to mention the Freedom Schools in the 1960s. So prior to Freedom Summer, when the movement's education efforts were aimed at adults, they created these freedom schools for young people. A lot of young people were getting involved in educational activities, in revolutionary activities. And so they wanted to kind of educate people, Black students, Black high school students who were expelled in schools for movement activities. And, the need of this was self-evident. On average, the Mississippi was spending 4 times as much educating whites as Blacks. And, at that time, people were living on plantations. It was an agrarian society. And so, plantation owners could work children as much as they wanted to. And so we see, again, like the importance of these private schools, these independent schools. And this is just a quote from Charlie Cobb about, the importance of freedom schools and what they did for people at that time. This was actually a pamphlet from the Freedom Schools. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of mention really briefly was the Black Panther Party. And so 2 years after they were founded in Oakland, California, they were creating all sorts of programming that they thought, organizing around social and educational programs that they thought would benefit Black communities around the country. And so they were having like, very material things like voter registration drives and medical clinics, but they also started schools. And part of their commitment to as part of their commitment to Black communities, the BPP began liberation schools led by volunteers and after school in storefronts, churches, and homes in 1969. Administrators built a curriculum that combined traditional subjects with activities that put students in direct contact with the mission of the Black Panther Party and systems of racial and class inequities that led to the civil rights and Black power struggles. And so they were learning, critical thinking skills at these schools. And so I guess we can talk about Black Feminist Study Hall a bit now. Ari and I get these materials. Ari and Giovanna, I don't know if you all want to jump in with like kind of like the story of the founding of Black Feminist Study Hall.
I guess, man, it seemed to happen so organically, which is what I love about a lot of the work that we do. I think just because of our similar backgrounds, obviously we're all, Black femmes. Just the work that we were doing in the community as well just seemed really aligned. And we had been following Giovanna's work and everything that she was doing with the Black Studies Reading Room. And I think we just thought that this would be a really great way to put all of our collective resources together in a way to not teach others about Black feminism, but to create a space where we could discuss it and learn together and study together, as Sierra was saying before, because it's so important. And I think through the Black Feminist Study Hall, we've really been able to cultivate an amazing sense of just camaraderie and understanding and learning what it means to decolonize how we do this work and also how we center each other and our capacities. And yeah, that's kind of just like my overview, but Giovanna, I don't know, from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can speak even more to the organic piece because I remember the precise moment when we decided that we were going to do this. And it came out, part of what it came out of was me asking Ariel and Sierra for advice for how to handle attention in the Black Studies Reading Room, which was at the time, and I guess I'll talk about it later, but the Black Studies Reading Room was mostly focused on kind of discussing Black literature, thought, art, and ideas in kind of like a public study setting, like at Trident Booksellers. We did a couple things with Tufts at something that was easy to get to by train. So that's why Trident was super easy. But one of the issues I had when I had ran it during one particular meeting was that I was running it on some kind of like Black feminist ethics around space making, around kind of how to pass the mic, around really foregrounding femme, queer folk in the space and thinking about like knowledge production and how to engage books. And I was also mostly focusing on Black femme writers the whole time. It was like not something I stated, but pretty much every book we read but one was by kind of a Black femme writer, and particularly a Black, largely cisgender like women writers. And so there was just one conversation we had where there were a couple folks there, men in the room, who just took up so much space. And it got to the point where it wasn't just like, oh, you're taking up space. It was a kind of violence, I think, around me leading, a kind of violence around kind of giving priority to other people in the space, and also a violence towards the author, the poet that we were reading, a poet who, the poetry wasn't even my favorite, but it was kind of coming from a place of criticism that began to shut down the whole room. And so I kind of felt responsible for not having laid down some community guidelines and been more explicit about kind of the Black feminist ethics informing the space. And so I think it was maybe, I don't know if it was weeks later, a couple months later, but I ended up talking to Ariel and Sierra about it and just being like, what does it mean? We asked, what does it mean to have a Black feminist space? What does that look like? What would I even have to say to make those intentions clear? And so that's when we came up with the idea of doing a study hall, when we were just like, these aren't new questions. We know that these are questions that have been asked throughout, even if Black feminism wasn't the language that was used. So maybe we should turn this into like a study possibility for everyone to be thinking about, like, what is a Black feminist practice of space making in the various kinds of work that people do. So that's like the moment, I think, where it became a thing that we wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and I think Giovanna and Ari, you guys kind of hit it on the head where it kind of became a space of refusal. And it became a space where we could actually have the conversations that we need to have, particularly, I think, being cited in Boston. The project that Ariel and I have is very site specific. There are no bookstores, period, in our hoods. There are no bookstores really in our neighborhoods. We have one in Roxbury that's relatively new. And so when we were thinking about, you know, like what we wanted to exist for ourselves, this is what we decided to create. We wanted to have a space to, you know, read these essays, read these books, and have these conversations. And so these are some images from our initial, our first couple Black feminist study halls. On the right, you'll see images of our first Black feminist study hall, the only one that we were able to have in person because of COVID. And this happened in December 2019. And since then, we've kind of shifted to the Zoom platform. Which I think like helped us help open us up a little bit, right? Like open us up to like a larger community that we, you know, being cited in Boston, we kind of were thinking about femmes that were here, but we realized how much of a need this was across America, across the globe. We had people from like Germany and South Africa and, you know, other places that were like coming into the space to have these conversations. And I guess we can talk a little bit about like what we've read.
Can I add something real quick? And I mean, we will talk about it more once we talk about what we read. But I think one of the pieces that set this apart to a certain extent was the end in itself was collective study. I think the end in itself was connecting with each other for people even on their own to create new social connections with each other through this work. And part of that intention, I think, came from the fact that a lot of the Black feminist teachings I had learned had been in support of a particular type of cause or a particular like a class or something where the output needed to be different. So we talked about Black feminism as a means to an end. And so one thing that we wanted to experiment with was like, well, what if simply understanding was the end? Mm-hmm. And so that's also what kind of framed what we were doing.
Right. I remember like in our initial conversation, we were talking a lot about that. And so I think the first thing, like our first conversation was actually about institutional critique of the things that we were going through at that time. And I remember we like kind of cited a bunch of different books and just had a general conversation about like how people found feminism, right? Like,
yeah. Mm-hmm. And we had group conversations for our first one. It's actually set up quite different because we didn't just have one text that we focused on for our first study hall. We kind of like acted like a library. We brought like our own texts, our own books for people to flip through and read and take notes from. We had like pamphlets printed. It was a very like physical experience, flipping through the pages, writing your notes down, looking at each other and exchanging ideas. And I feel like it definitely changed when we had to move to Zoom, but almost in like not in a better way, but in like a different and, like you said, more expansive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the second thing that we read was The Sweetness of Salt by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And that was actually a text that Giovanna chose and was like very moved by. And so we just like had a really quick conversation. It was just like, well, what do you want to read? Or I think that we had like an idea of like something else that we wanted to read, and then we decided to go with Alexis Pauline Gumbs. The third one being with Sita Volshun, one of our like friends in the community, and we read Sisters of the Yam, and she actually led us through like some methods of spiritual protection, and it was like high key like school. Like I think that was like maybe the most instructional one that we've had, because she was teaching us like very material ways. I think especially, you know, in June, it was like still like in the depths of the pandemic, still not really knowing what would happen, I think, you know, as we've discovered over the past couple months. And so we were really like learning like methods of ancestral revenants. Ari, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Oh, yeah. And so basically, Sita Volshun, she is an Afro-Indigenous healer based here in Boston. So basically what she was pulling from is the Black American tradition of hoodoo and root work. and using things from the earth to really protect your spirit. And we obviously connected that with Bill Hooks. And I think we read the first 4 chapters of Sisters of the Yam. And yeah, that was great. I think it was good for people to have like a material way to kind of protect themselves. I think there are a lot of like immaterial pieces of advice that we give people: sleep more, you know, drink water, exercise. But in reality, spirituality requires a lot more than that. And we were able to touch into that side of Black feminism specifically with this particular study hall.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Should I go into the next one?
Yeah.
I'm so awkward. And then the next Black feminist study hall we did was called River Crossing. So we read June Jordan's essay, Many Rivers to Cross, this was a really, really emotional study hall. We did it with Belfina, who runs this site called The Womanist Reader. She's amazing. You should definitely check her out. She has a ton of womanist and Black feminist texts available for free, PDFs and other resources. So we teamed up with her for this Black feminist study hall. And basically in this essay, June Jordan is describing the death of her mother. And so it brought up a lot of visceral reactions from people and just comments about their relationships with the different Black femmes in their life and the impact that these relationships have had on them. And yeah, I don't know how y'all felt in that one, but I felt like that was probably the most emotional study hall that we've ever had, where people were like very, very invested in this conversation.
Yeah, and I'd say like emotional and also just like very vulnerable. I think since, you know, the beginning, we've kind of cultivated this space where people feel comfortable having real conversations. I think one of the tenets of Black feminism is like the lived experience. And so that was one of the ones where we really delved into people's lived experiences and their ideas around what it means to like stand up for yourself. And a lot of the things actually very connected to protecting the spirits. It's actually very perfect that we had them one after the other. Giovanna, do you want to say anything before we move on?
Nah, I was a participant for those 2. And so it was just really a pleasure to like actually just be able to participate and to kind of support by way of like cheering on y'all as facilitators, but also experiencing the model, I guess you could say, that we had cultivated and believed in. And so getting to experience it was just like, it was just lovely.
Yeah. And then y'all want to talk about some of like the formal mechanisms of like space making that we used in this one that we didn't use? Or I mean, we never really worked together before this, but the formal mechanisms of space making, because we had like community agreements and we had like, you know, note takers. You know, do you all want to delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, I can definitely say that we definitely, from the beginning, after our conversation with Giovanna, we agreed that we needed community guidelines. A huge part of our work is making sure that we center queer and trans Black femmes. And we wanted to make sure that we were creating spaces that were centering the most marginalized people of our community. And so we felt definitely like guidelines were important, because sometimes people get into spaces and they either take up too much space, they don't know when to stop talking and let others talk. Sometimes people come in with homophobic or transphobic attitudes. And I mean, I could think of kind of like one instance maybe in particular where I feel like we really had to have a discussion about what would happen if we really had to enforce the guidelines. I don't think we've really had to yet, but I think it's been good to set parameters for people coming into the space of letting them know what we will and won't accept. And I mean, they're pretty basic guidelines, you know, step up, step back.
Yeah, parting the way is to learn.
Yep.
Being elitist.
Yes, yeah, no elitism, no homophobia, no transphobia, respecting pronouns.
Yeah, and it goes, I mean, we model them off of the ones that we find. I mean, Ari, Giovanna, and I have all been in organizing community for a while now, and so we model them off the ones that we access when we're in those other organizing communities. And this is just a quote that, you know, I liked. And I think that's something that we like talk about a lot. Like, if you're free, then you need to free someone else. If you have power, then your job is to empower someone else. And we try to do that in our spaces. The Black Studies Reading Room. I'll read the text at the bottom, and then Giovanna, do you just want to go into like how you came up with it and what we were about in the beginning?
Read the first part, and then I want you to ask me the questions you asked me through text when I said what you want me to talk about. Because I'm better at answering your question than just going off jump.
Okay, so Giovanna Jones started the Black Studies Reading Room. It was a monthly conversation on Black lit, art, and ideas held from May 2019 to March 2020. Its purpose was to make more space for the creative and communal work of Black study in and around Boston. The meetings were held monthly at Trident Booksellers and Cafe, with occasional collaborations with the Tufts University Galleries and Printing Dead. And so I guess I wanted you to talk about, you know, what you thought, what were you first thinking about, you know, when you started the Black Studies Reading Room?
The immediate thought was I didn't feel like talking to folks at Harvard anymore. like I just like point blank, I think growing up in Randolph, working with organizations in Roxbury, kind of like through my youth, moving to Atlanta and then coming back to go to Harvard. I mostly went for the funding, but also I was there and I really had to confront kind of the gatekeeping in African American studies, both in that department straight up, but then also just kind of the kind of Black intelligista way that kind of protects the eliteness of African American studies in some way as a way to authorize that work. And so to be caught up in it as a graduate student was really difficult, because I noticed that the deeper I got into that mode of Black studies in academia in that particular way, the further I got from the actual, like the communities, the people that who had taught me way before I had even gone to college. And so a lot of it was me just being interested in wanting to be engaged in conversation about like literature and about art, and to know that to come from the standpoint of the institution and I guess realize just how many resources there were in, say, kind of like the museums and the Black artists that they would show, or the Black archives that they would display, or the literature, like the scholarship that I was introduced to through grad school and felt was really important, but knew that I wasn't going to know about some of these people had I not been in grad school, or I would have found out in some different way. Like there are certain folks who I didn't hear discussed, like outside of the grad school context. And not that the ideas needed to stay there, but that's kind of what that gatekeeping was about. And so, yeah, I was just really interested in being like, okay, well then what if we had this study, but anybody could come. It happens once a month. It happens just somewhere else that's not the academy. So it's not like you're reserving a room at Harvard, which often happens, and inviting everyone in, but it's like, nah, like, let's just do this somewhere else and see if other folks are interested in having these conversations around these texts. And I think for me, as someone who's interested in public pedagogy, sometimes I'm like, you know, when we're talking about a certain book, whether somebody just strolled into the meeting, which happened often, or somebody read the whole book, what do people have to know when we come to the table in order for us to have a productive conversation? And that could simply mean, you know, like I've taught you this background on this author just real quick. I very quickly said, you know, the stakes of the book, and then everyone's kind of can come to the table with how they, like when and where they enter, basically. Who said when and where they enter? Oh my goodness. I'm thinking of an activist, I want to call her name, from way back when in like the 1910s. I'm going to forget it, but that's her phrase, when and where we enter. And so that was my approach. And then logistically, Trident Booksellers, I had done a lot. I just liked going there. It was always open late. They had a restaurant and beverages, and I would go there. And for Black History Month of 2019, they didn't have like any programming. And at first I was like, okay, I'm not going there anymore. But then I was like, you know what? I see what kind of books y'all hold. There's no reason you shouldn't be having something here, especially with your how accessible kind of the space is transportation wise. So yeah, I just reached out to them and was kind of, we did a Black History Month event, and then folks enjoyed it and they were like, let's keep doing this. So I guess the Black Studies Reading Room also came out very organically, just an intersection of how I'd already been feeling about like pedagogy and just wanting to be in conversation with other folks, like folks, again, in a more informal space in the way I first learned about some of these topics in Black Studies. But then also, I think just cool people at Trident, like who just stayed committed, who let me use the space for free. Sometimes they would do little drink specials, who did some promo, like it just worked as a collaboration, a short-term collaboration like that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering if we have any questions, please drop them in the chat if you have any, but I guess just to, because we are running up against time, kind of end it, I did want to say that, you know, we are in community with a lot of other people, and so you should definitely follow the people that you see here, because it's not just us. There's like a very large community of Black femmes that are doing this work. Yeah, thank you all. Giovanna, did you want to say anything kind of about like, earlier today we were talking about like archiving and space making, and how, like, why these spaces are important, and what happens to the ephemera that we create in these spaces.
Yeah, so and I guess I'll be brief. There is such a gulf between the resources that preservationists need to like preserve material, and it usually ends up being moneyed institutions that have the resources to preserve material. The very kinds of institutions that end up gentrifying neighborhoods and doing all sorts of stuff. And so I was well aware of that tension, especially with family who'd grown up in like the South End in Roxbury and who wanted places to store their papers, but didn't trust a place like Northeastern. And so I guess maybe if we were to think about, say, what does a future of informal Black study look like? I would want us to continue thinking a lot about like, where do we hold and preserve our stuff, and to whose benefit? What does it mean to be able to kind of decentralize the university as the primary space for our archives and our stuff? Like, what does it mean to, you know, to walk up into historical societies where, for the most part, a lot of historical societies, you don't actually have to be a member to use their reading rooms, as I just learned with the Evanston History Center. And there's a wealth of material. I was telling Sierra today, like going off about how I just learned today about a Black woman who ran a boarding house for Black girls from like 1917 to 1970. And I was just all up in those archives, and they didn't need my school ID. They didn't really know much about me other than I just wanted to look at those materials. And so I think I really am interested in what does it mean to both preserve these things, but to also study them. For me to look at this woman's, you know, back and forth between building inspectors to learn a little bit something about what it means to, you know, have to maintain and protect space for years on end, and what Black women had to go through and have to go through now to do that. When we talk about stuff like property, when we talk about stuff like displacement and inheritance and all of that. So yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I won't go into it, but I do think that's another phase of informal study. What do we study? What materials do we have at our disposal? What do these materials teach us on top of the oral histories that we have, and people who can just share their own context? And so yeah, I would want to think a lot about materials moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna stop sharing. And if we have any questions, I guess I'll ask you to drop them in the chat. Claudia says, in the language that the institutions use to describe them. Another reason why we need to create our own institutions, which is, you know, kind of what Giovanna and Ari and I were thinking about when we created this space, was how do we create the anti-institution? How do we think about, you know, spaces where we can be ourselves?
Thank you guys. Thank you all so much. This has been phenomenal. Rana, Ari, Sierra, thank you so much. Oh, let me stop the recording now.